Mom moved her friend and kids into my room, so I left to pay the bills at home, and now she's begging me to come back. Although living at home at the age of 23 wasn't exactly what I had planned for my life, it worked out for the most part. I wasn't simply lounging around, playing video games and eating snacks. I was paying my rent, my mom's phone bill, and my power bill. I had my own place, home-cooked meals, and was able to concentrate on my freelance job without having to worry about large bills. I had even converted my room into a small studio for my content creation gigs, which I hoped would gain popularity soon. All in all, the arrangement was very fantastic. Everything was good until Kelly, my mom's best friend, moved in with her 2 children. I wasn't happy about it, but I could understand why. Kelly was going through a difficult divorce, and her husband was a total jerk, according to my mom, so they needed a place to stay, and our house was the best choice. They stayed in the guest room at first, and it wasn't a big deal. Sure, the kids were a little noisy, but I just closed my door and put on my headphones. I assumed it would only be temporary, only a few weeks until Kelly got back on her feet. I assumed that was the arrangement and didn't think much about it, but that quickly changed. The guest room wasn't very large, but it was sufficient for Kelly and her children to stay in for a time. I couldn't believe what I saw when I walked in one day after running some errands and saw something strange right away. My door was open, and I could hear children laughing inside. My studio setup, including my pricey microphone, lighting, and camera, was pushed into a corner as if it didn't matter. Kelly's kids were running around like they owned the place. My desk chair was shifted. My bed was covered in toys, and one of the kids was on my computer. I was so shocked that I probably screamed, "What the hell is going on?" louder than I should have. "Calm your tits," my mother replied. "It's not a big deal. The kids needed more space, and your room is the biggest. It's only fair." My mother walked in and began berating me as if I was the one who was out of line. Fair? The room for which I was paying rent. She dismissed me as though I were being silly when I informed her that I wanted them out of my room right away, saying, "You're being selfish. They need to be comfortable." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't about comfort, it was about respect. My room wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a place where I worked. I had spent more than $3,000 on my studio setup, so I couldn't just put it in a corner and forget about it. My mother was not amenable to my explanations, saying, "They're just kids. They want to play on your computer. Stop making such a fuss." I quickly put an end to that notion, saying, "They are not touching my equipment in any way, and if they do, I'm in serious trouble." Kelly then said, "Oh, come on. They're just curious, and you can't blame them. Maybe if you weren't so stiff, they'd listen to you." I was shocked. I wasn't uptight. I was just trying to protect the things I had worked so hard to acquire. I told Kelly bluntly that her children couldn't touch my belongings and that I would hold her accountable if they did. Kelly called me selfish, and my mother agreed. All of a sudden, I was the villain in my own house. The home became uncomfortable after that initial outburst. And I was shocked that my mom and Kelly were against me, especially because I was the one who was paying the rent. However, I assumed that after they calmed down, they would see how absurd this was. I tried to talk to my mom again the following day, explaining how important my studio equipment was to me, both financially and professionally. Freelancing isn't just a pastime, it's my job. And I couldn't function without it, and it would take months or maybe years to replace it. I'm not trying to be rude, but this is unfair, Mom. You gave it away without even asking me. And I'm paying the rent for that room. You're being dramatic. It's my house, and I decide what happens in it, she retorted. Your house? I pay rent. I'm contributing here. Not just squatting for free, I exclaimed in shock. The kids need space. Your brother's room is too small, and your sister's room is full of her things. Besides, your room has all that fancy stuff. And they like it better. She shrugged as if it didn't matter. My sister's room was nearly as large as mine, and to be honest, she hardly used it because she was always out with her friends. But my mother wouldn't even entertain the possibility that my siblings, both of whom were 15, had perfectly good rooms. My brother's was smaller, but it was still large enough for 2 children. She claimed that the kids adore your room since it is cooler and that all of your glitzy devices add to their enjoyment. Fun? This wasn't about having fun. My room served as a place where I lived, worked, and unwound, not as a play area for Kelly's children. What are you going to replace anything if they break it? Because I can't afford to, I asked her. Oh, stop being so paranoid. They're kids, not monsters. If you just let them play, they'd probably leave your stuff alone, Kelly added. At that point, letting them play on my $3,000 setup? Are you serious? No way, I yelled. You're being selfish. This is a difficult time for us, and you're making it all about you, said Kelly, rolling her eyes. When I finally had enough, I turned to my mother and told her. I have to move my stuff out if they're staying in my room. I can't risk them damaging it. Where are you going to put it? There's no space anywhere else, she asked, laughing. Really laughing. I raised my voice and said, So I'm just supposed to let them trash my stuff? How is that fair? Life is unfair. You're an adult. You should be able to handle a little inconvenience, my mother said, shaking her head. A minor annoyance? No, it was disrespectful to be evicted from my own room. I had paid rent for that space, and now I was not only unable to use it, but I was also prohibited from entering my room, which my mother claimed was their space now, and that I had no right to enter. I spent the next few days attempting to avoid being at home as much as possible, hanging out at coffee shops and working on my laptop, but it wasn't the same without my studio setup. I was falling behind on deadlines, my productivity plummeted, and my stress levels were through the sky. Look, I replied, I'll work out a deal. Let me move my setup into the guest room, and they stay in my room. That way, I can continue working, and they can have the space they need. This was my final attempt to talk sense into my mother's head. No. You'll just have to wait until Kelly gets back on her feet. The guest room is too small for all your stuff, she said without even considering it. How long will that take? I questioned impatiently. As long as it takes, she shrugged, adding, You don't get to set deadlines for other people's struggles. I wanted to help Kelly and her children because I knew they were going through a difficult time, but this wasn't helping, it was enabling. Kelly wasn't paying anything to stay with us, and now I was essentially being forced out of my own life to make room for them. I couldn't believe this was happening. I heard Kelly moaning about me later that night in the kitchen, calling me immature and selfish, saying, He doesn't even understand how hard this is for us. He's just being a brat. He's always been stubborn. He'll get over it. My mother concurred. That was the last straw. I knew they didn't give a damn about me or my predicament. I was simply a paycheck to my mom and a barrier to Kelly and her children. They wouldn't listen, and they wouldn't change. Despite the odd turmoil, I loved living at home. It was affordable, and I got along with my brothers. However, I couldn't continue to live somewhere where I wasn't appreciated. So, I started looking for rooms to rent. The following day, after feeling like a stranger in my own house for days, I finally had enough and realized that respect was more important than the room anymore. I was trying to establish a future for myself, pay my bills, and pay my rent. But neither my mom nor Kelly seemed to care. They had decided that my needs came last, and I was sick of it. I thought that if I could show my mom how serious I was, she would finally listen. One evening, when it was just the two of us and my siblings were upstairs and Kelly was putting her kids to bed, I sat my mom down in the living room. Mom, I said calmly, at the beginning, we need to talk. She looked at me wearily and said, "What now?" I said, "I can't continue to live this way. You gave it away without asking, and it's unfair. I've been paying rent for that room. And now I can't even use it. We've been through this. It's temporary. Kelly and the kids are going through a hard time. You're young and you can adapt," she said, leaning back on the couch with a sigh. "You didn't ask me. You just decided that my room wasn't mine anymore, and now I can't even work since everything I own is packed up or pushed into a corner." "That's not the point," I shot back. "It's about respect, not about adjusting." She waved me away and remarked, "You're being dramatic. This is my house, and I get to decide what happens in it." It seemed like a slap in the face each time she uttered that line. I remarked, "If this is your house, then why am I paying rent? Perhaps I shouldn't be paying anything at all if you're going to treat me like a guest." "Don't you dare pull that. You know I need your help with the bills," she said, her eyes narrowing. I yelled, "That's not how this works. You can't take my money every month and then turn around and say I have no say, then treat me like I don't matter. What do you want me to do? Throw Kelly and her kids out on the street? They have nowhere else to go," she said, giving me a crazy eyes look. "No, but there are other options. They could move into one of my siblings' rooms or stay in the guest room. Hell, you could even rotate rooms so everyone takes turns sharing the space. But taking my room and locking me out? That's not okay," I said, shaking my head. "Your room was the best option," my mother said, crossing her arms. "Your brother and sister are too young to share their rooms. And the guest room is too small for 3 people. "No," I shot back. "It was the simplest solution. You dumped it on me because you didn't want to handle the hassle. The last word." "I'll make this simple," I said, staring her in the eye. "Either Kelly and the kids move out of my room, or I move out of the house. Those are your options." My irritation bubbled over at that moment. Surprised, she blinked. "Don't be crazy. Where would you even go?" she said. I informed her. "If you don't respect me or the fact that I'm paying to live here, then I'll find somewhere else to live." I had already begun looking for rooms to rent. "You're bluffing. You can't afford to move out," she sneered. "Try me," I said, leaning back and crossing my arms. My mom didn't take me seriously, which only strengthened my resolve. So, I spent every free moment looking through rental listings, messaging landlords, and figuring out my budget. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew I could make it work if I cut back on non-essentials. The next few days were stressful. I didn't bring up the ultimatum again, but it hung in the air like a storm cloud. At home, however, things deteriorated. Kelly's children had transformed my room into their own playground, and I was not even permitted to enter without someone yelling. One day, I attempted to get some books and a set of headphones that I had left behind, but Kelly stopped me with her fists on her hips. She stood in the doorway and demanded, "What are you doing in here?" I tried to seem calm as I said, "I need my stuff. This is their room now, so you can't just walk in whenever you want," she said, shaking her head. I was dumbfounded as I looked at her and said, "Are you serious? This is my room." "Not anymore," she stated in a cold tone. "You have to respect their personal space." With clenched teeth, I answered, "I'm paying rent for this room, so I'll gather my belongings and go. But don't tell me to respect their space when no one respects mine." The irony almost made me giggle. My mom wasn't going to support me, and Kelly wasn't going to change, so I knew that if I wanted things to improve, I would have to take matters into my own hands. She muttered something under her breath and left. But the damage was already done. The landlord was friendly, the room was clean enough, and most importantly, I could set up my studio without worrying about kids touching my equipment. I found a room for rent a week after the ultimatum, which was within my budget. It was a small space in an older building, but it was mine when I signed the lease. I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness because I had to put myself first, even if it meant leaving behind the house I'd grown up in. I didn't tell my mom right away because I wanted to make sure everything was finalized before I dropped the bombshell. After I signed the lease for my new place, I knew I had to act quickly because if I gave my mom too much notice, she would find a way to make the move even more difficult. I carefully planned it out and told a few close friends about it. And 2 of them agreed to help me pack and move my belongings. One of them even offered to record everything on their phone, just in case things got ugly. I knew it would be difficult, especially with my mom and Kelly breathing down my neck, but I didn't care anymore. I wanted to give my mom one last chance to make amends, so I sat down with her the night before the move. "Mom," I began calmly, "I'm moving out tomorrow, and I found a place to rent." Startled, she raised her head from her phone and said, "You're really doing this?" "Yes," I replied, nodding. "You didn't give me a lot of options." "You're overreacting. This whole thing is temporary," she said, rolling her eyes. I firmly stated, "It's not nothing. You treated me like a disposable object. Gave away my room, locked me out, and told me I had no say in the matter. You know I need your rent money to keep this house running. If you leave, how am I supposed to pay the bills?" She groaned as if I were wearing her out. "You made it obvious that this isn't my house. You stated that it's your house, your rules. Well, if that's the case, then I don't have to stay here," I answered, pushing off a twinge of remorse. "So, you're just going to leave us high and dry?" She glared at me. I shrugged and said, "I don't owe you anything. You can ask Kelly or her husband, since they're still married, to start paying the rent." I decided to leave after she gave me a chilly glance and returned to her phone without saying anything else. My friends arrived early the following day with a rented van and a few cars, and we were prepared to finish everything as soon as possible. I had previously packed the majority of my belongings into boxes, but I still needed to move my studio setup out of my old room. The kids were running around the living room, and Kelly was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee when we arrived at the house. She looked at me suspiciously as soon as I entered. She narrowed her eyes and questioned, "What's going on?" "I'm leaving," I said plainly. "Really? You're leaving because of this? That's pathetic," she said, raising her eyebrows. Ignoring her, I went upstairs to my room. Or what had been my room, and when I opened the door, I was nearly sickened by what I saw. My desk was cluttered with random items, my computer, microphone, and camera were crammed into a corner, and they appeared to have been neglected for weeks. "Start recording," I said, turning to one of my buddies as I gently started packing away my equipment. He took out his phone and started shooting. And Kelly must have recognized what was going on because she walked upstairs and began to yell, "This is their room now, so you can't just walk in here and start taking stuff," she yelled. "It's my stuff, Kelly. I paid for it, and I'm taking it with me," I said, turning to face her while maintaining my composure. "You're being ridiculous. You're throwing a tantrum over a couple of kids needing space," she said, crossing her arms. "This isn't a tantrum," I responded steadily. "This is me defending myself. You and my mother have treated me as though I'm unimportant, and I'm over it. My mom came upstairs to see what was going on, and when she saw the empty room, she flipped out." She started screaming again, but I ignored her and continued packing. My friends helped me load everything into the van, while one of them continued to film in case Kelly or my mom tried to pull something. She said, her voice trembling with rage, "You're really leaving us just because you didn't get your way?" I gave her a direct look and said, "I'm leaving because you didn't respect me. You made it clear that I'm not a priority here, so I'm making myself a priority. I paid rent for this room, and you gave it away without even asking. Don't. I've made my decision," I said, holding up a hand as she opened her lips to disagree. Kelly stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. gazing at me as I carried the last box out to the van. "Good luck out there," she murmured cynically. "Because when things get tough, you'll realize how selfish you've been." I simply got into the van and drove off with my companions without even bothering to answer. My mom was outraged and accused me of being selfish and thoughtless for leaving her in a difficult situation, saying that I was quitting the family and leaving her to handle the bills alone. That night, after I had moved into my new house and begun unpacking, my phone exploded with texts from her. One text said, "I can't believe you do this to me after everything I've done for you. You've always been so selfish." She had made her decisions, and now I was making mine. So I typed up a response but erased it since I didn't owe her an explanation. As soon as I moved into my new home, I was relieved that there would be no more arguments, disrespect, or most importantly, that I didn't matter. My new room was smaller. And the building wasn't exactly the best, but it was quiet, and it was mine. I started by unpacking my studio gear and carefully arranging it in my room's corner. I felt like I could finally breathe for the first time in weeks. However, the tranquility was short-lived. Trips of guilt. The following morning, my mom began bombarding my phone with messages asking whether I had paid the rent for the month. When I told her that I wasn't paying because I had moved out, she became furious. She texted, "You owe me for the remainder of this month, and you haven't even reached the 25th yet." I rolled my eyes and said, "No, I don't. You can ask Kelly to pay the rent because I'm not living there anymore. Kelly doesn't have money to pay rent, you know that. You're leaving me to handle everything on my own, and I can't afford it." She said, almost immediately. I replied by text, "That's not my problem. You stated clearly that it's your house and your rules. Now it's your bills and your responsibility." That response infuriated her, and she began accusing me of being ungrateful, selfish, and immature, saying that my departure was tearing the family apart. Initially, the guilt began to seep in. But I reminded myself of why I had left in the first place. My mom had treated me like a throwaway object, so why should I feel guilty about prioritizing myself? I had always contributed financially, and I knew my efforts had made a significant impact. My mom sent me lengthy, meandering texts about how I was ruining things the following week, and the guilt trips escalated into fury. "Everyone in the family is asking why you left, and I don't know what to tell them," one text said. It was amazing how much better I felt without all the chaos and negativity weighing me down. So I didn't bother responding because I knew that anything I said would only make things worse. Instead, I concentrated on getting settled in my new home, catching up on work, and getting my studio back up and running. My sister contacted me unexpectedly a few days later, and since I hadn't heard from her since I moved out, I assumed she wanted to check in. However, as soon as I answered, I knew she had other plans. She skipped the small conversation and exclaimed, "Mom is really upset. She says you're not paying rent this month. And now she's freaking out about the bills." I said calmly, "Not living there anymore. Why should I pay rent for a place I'm not living in?" My sister countered, "But you know she can't afford it without you. Why stop now? You've always helped out." I told her straight out. Because she didn't respect me. She gave away my room, locked me out, and treated me like I didn't matter. I'm done being taken advantage of. "It's not that easy," my sister replied. "Mom is just trying to help, and Kelly is going through a lot." I groaned. "I understand that, but why does assisting Kelly mean that I'm being taken advantage of? I paid the rent for that room, so I had every right to keep it," my sister added pathetically. "She's just stressed out and didn't mean to screw you over," I retorted. "So am I, but nobody gave a damn when I was being forced out of my own room." I could tell she was stuck in the middle. But I wasn't going to allow her to shame me into changing my opinion, so I hung up after we spoke for a few more minutes, largely about her school-related issues. A final stunt my mother began to pull was cutting off her texts. As the days passed, I believe she understood I wouldn't back down, but she did one more thing that made me glad I had left. I received a text message one morning saying, "Hey, I heard about the drama with your mom. Are you okay?" From a relative I hadn't spoken to in years. I asked them what they were talking about. Confused, and they sent me a screenshot of one of my mom's Facebook posts. She portrayed me as the bad guy in it, saying that I had abandoned her and the family when they were in need. Omitting the part where she gave away my room, of course, and making it seem as though I had departed out of pure resentment. I was incensed. Arguing with me in private was one thing. But sharing our private problems on the internet? That was too much. I didn't reply to the post because I thought it wasn't worth the trouble. If she had to play the victim, then let her. I knew the truth, and so did the people who really mattered. My mom still texts me occasionally, but I limit the conversation to neutral subjects and keep it brief. I've learned to set boundaries and am no longer allowing her to guilt-trip me. Now, a month later, I'm completely settled in my new place. My work is back on track. My stress levels are significantly lower, and I'm finally beginning to feel like myself again. If my mom couldn't give me the respect I deserve, I had to find it somewhere. Moving out was the best thing I could have done for myself, and I'm not looking back. Do I feel awful about leaving? Sometimes, yes. It's terrible that things had to end this way. But I don't regret my choice. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you. My parents left me with my grandparents for my siblings' sake. Years later, I planned a special dinner, but they prioritized my brother's gift instead. I'd like to make it clearly obvious that I've never been the favorite child in my family. This is not an exaggeration or a fake idea that I made up. It is a very genuine and major component of my existence. Growing up, my parents never concealed the fact that my younger brother's life was more important to them than mine. For reference, my mother became pregnant with my brother only a year after I was born. While it was not a planned pregnancy, my parents were pleased with the prospect of expanding their family. However, their delight swiftly changed to dread when physicians did several tests and revealed that the baby may have major health difficulties. These were not trivial worries. They were serious enough that my parents had to make the sad decision to terminate the pregnancy. They eventually agreed to continue, fully aware of the potential hurdles. When my brother Jackson was born, their concerns were realized. He had serious heart abnormalities that necessitated prompt treatment. My folks were distraught. Jackson needed many procedures to survive and spent extensive time in the hospital. His health became the primary focus of my family's life, and this transition had a significant impact on everything, including how I was treated. My parents were obsessed with worry, love, and guilt about Jackson's health, while I recognized that they were dealing with a really tough situation. It also meant that I was largely marginalized. My parents were too worried with Jackson's medical demands, so I stayed with my grandparents while he was in the hospital. During this time, they paid me just occasional visits. Even at such a young age, I tried not to hold it against them. I recognized that Jackson's health came first, and my parents were trying their best. Besides, I really liked my time with my grandparents. They were nice and attentive. Every morning, my grandma made me breakfast, and we spent hours doing simple things around the house like baking cookies or taking care of her garden. My grandfather used to take me to the park and read me stories. They filled in the gap left by my parents' absence, becoming almost like a second set of parents for me. Jackson's condition gradually improved, and my parents were allowed to bring him home from the hospital. You'd assume this would be the point where my parents would come to get me, where they'd like to reconcile the family. But no, it was not the case. My mother, still burdened by the stress of Jackson's recuperation and the effort of caring for a sick child, decided she was not ready to take on the responsibility of 2 children. She informed my grandparents that they would need to continue caring for me for a bit longer. My father, who was preoccupied with work and attempting to balance Jackson's medical expenditures, also provided little assistance. My grandparents, who genuinely enjoyed having me around, didn't say anything when my parents opted to leave me with them for a longer period of time. They were delighted to keep me with them, while I was saddened to learn that I would not be returning home. I was not devastated. I was still in a location where I felt loved, which reassured me. The true issue arose when years passed and my parents still showed no desire to bring me back home. What was supposed to be a temporary arrangement lasted eternally. I could only visit them every other weekend, and that wasn't assured. My father was sometimes too busy at work, and other times they simply did not make an effort to visit. My grandparents were my primary caregivers, while my parents felt more like tourists than parents. When I first started school, my grandparents took care of everything. They dropped me off in the morning, picked me up in the afternoon, and were there from the moment I awoke until I was tucked into bed. They made sure I got my school materials, assisted me with my homework, and kept me healthy. In contrast, my parents never checked on me. They didn't care if I went to school every day or how well I did academically. If I was sick, my grandparents would look after me. My grandparents seemed to have taken on all of my parents' obligations. When my parents came to visit, they only talked about Jackson. They would tell my grandparents how amazing Jackson was, how brave he had been while recovering from his surgeries, and how far he had come. I don't think they ever asked my grandparents how I was doing, what was going on in my life, or how I felt. I started to feel totally invisible. I can't remember a single instance when my parents and I spent time together, just the three of us. There was no one-on-one time and no attempt to repair any bond with me. It was always about Jackson. Then came the moment I'll never forget, Jackson's birthday celebration. My parents organized a great celebration for him because he was doing so well. They invited everyone, friends, family, and neighbors. My grandparents brought me along. Throughout the celebration, I couldn't get over my intense envy as I saw Jackson so joyful, with my parents doting on him continuously. The entire celebration revolved around him, and while I understood it was his special day, I couldn't help but feel entirely excluded. I was a youngster as well, but my brother received all of the attention, love, and care that I craved. I'm not sure when or how, but the strong feelings of witnessing my parents around my younger brother surfaced. Before I knew it, I had broken into tears in front of everyone. I remember feeling so embarrassed in that moment, knowing that everyone could see me unraveling. My grandparents, bless their hearts, promptly brought me to a room and attempted to console me, but the pain and jealousy were too great. I believe some of the other visitors noticed and attempted to console me, but nothing genuinely improved my mood. It wasn't about the gifts or the party. It was about the attention and love I so desperately craved. Watching my parents lavish Jackson with attention and love was simply too much for me to stomach. Later, after the birthday party, my parents and grandparents had a heated argument. Apparently, my parents were embarrassed by my emotional outburst at the celebration. They thought it was foolish of me to cry in front of everyone, and they believed my actions had drawn unwanted attention to them. It wasn't simply that I was irritated, it had caused others to doubt my living circumstances. Guests began to question why I wasn't at home with my parents, why I was being raised by my grandparents, and if my parents were abandoning me. My parents were unhappy with the scrutiny and blamed me for forcing them to explain themselves. Following the disagreement, I made a decision. I would return home to live with my parents. This was something I had wanted for years, but when it finally happened, I didn't feel as excited as I had hoped. Instead, I felt apprehension. The first few days back home were incredibly awkward. The house felt foreign to me, and I frequently felt out of place, as if I were invading someone else's territory. My parents designed their routines totally on Jackson's wants and schedule. They rarely acknowledged me, and when they did, it was always in passing. I had imagined that moving back home would finally make my parents notice me, that they would care about me as much as they did about Jackson. However, it soon became evident that nothing had changed. Jackson was still the center of the universe, while I remained on the periphery, disregarded and forgotten. I was merely happy to have my own room. I spent the majority of my time there while I wasn't in school. I didn't want to be alone. Yet being around my parents made me feel even more inconspicuous. At least in my room, I didn't have to watch their devotion for Jackson while I went unnoticed. I'd spend hours there, completing my homework or lying on my bed, trying to make sense of everything. Throughout my scholastic years, my parents exhibited no interest in my studies or accomplishments. They never asked about my schoolwork or attended any of my award ceremonies. Even when I participated in school plays or extracurricular activities, they didn't bother showing up or acknowledging my participation. It seemed like nothing I did mattered to them, despite their utter contempt for my accomplishments. I made an effort to excel in school. My grandparents' limited attempts to intervene and remind my parents of my accomplishments were received with silence or plain disdain. They would push my parents to express their happiness or gratitude for me, but they either disregarded or scoffed, as if my accomplishments were unimportant. It stung so much to see how little they cared, especially given how they handled Jackson. Jackson never did well academically. He struggled in school and frequently got into trouble. He would bring home grades, and his teachers would occasionally call home to discuss his behavior, but none of this seemed to bother my parents. They never held Jackson responsible for his lack of effort, and they certainly did not chastise him if he ever managed to score even nearly average on a test or accomplish something minor. My parents would praise it as if it were a monumental feat. They would order pizza or take us out to his favorite restaurant, making it a huge family outing. When I finally finished high school and was accepted to college, I was fortunate to receive a partial scholarship. Even though it paid some of the fees, I was concerned about how I would handle the remaining bills. At the time, I asked my parents if they had set up a college fund for me. Part of me knew the answer, yet I felt compelled to inquire. As expected, they promptly informed me that all of the money they were saving was for Jackson. They stated he was the youngest and would need to be cared for in the future. My father openly informed me that as the oldest, I needed to learn to take care of myself. He did offer to assist me in applying for an education loan, which I would then be responsible for repaying once I found work. It was quite painful to learn that my own parents continued to disregard me. While most parents are delighted and proud to assist their children in their transition into adulthood, mine were practically telling me I was on my own. Fortunately, my grandparents saw this coming long before I did. They had been quietly planning for my future, and had secretly established a trust fund for me years before. When they finally revealed this to me and told me that I didn't have to worry about college, I was completely surprised. I couldn't believe someone cared enough to do this for me. I cried with excitement because for the first time, I felt truly supported. It was surreal. No one had ever gone to such lengths to protect me. My grandparents not only saw my talent, but they also took steps to ensure that I could attend college without financial constraints. However, when my parents learned about the trust fund that my grandparents had established for me, they did not share my excitement or relief. Instead of being delighted for me, they immediately turned the subject to Jackson. Their first query to my grandparents was if they had also established a trust fund for Jackson. My grandfather gently explained that they had intentionally chosen to care for me because my parents had always favored Jackson. They indicated that they had witnessed for years how I had been disregarded and wanted to give me a fair shot to thrive without being held back. Naturally, this did not sit well with my folks. They felt it was unfair and quickly got into a furious dispute with my grandparents about how both grandchildren should be treated equally. They accused my grandparents of favoritism and demanded that Jackson, as the youngest member of the family, deserved his share of the money. They couldn't believe my grandparents had chosen to help me because they saw how neglected I had been all these years. My parents seemed to be unaware that they had spent Jackson's entire life treating him as if he were the center of the universe. Despite the pressure and accusations, my grandparents held their stance. They refused to back down or let my parents manipulate the issue. They clarified that this was not about favoritism. Rather, it was about ensuring that I had the same opportunities as Jackson, which my parents had previously provided. My grandparents made their decision out of love and fairness, knowing that I had not received the same attention and support that Jackson had. After failing to persuade my grandparents, my parents focused their efforts on me. They tried to persuade me to share some of the trust fund with them, claiming that I should invest in Jackson's future when he went to college. They portrayed it as if I was greedy for retaining the money for myself, despite the fact that it was not mine to give away. It was a gift from my grandparents. I refused. I informed them that it was not my obligation to care for Jackson's schooling, especially since they had always stated that their financial priority was with him. My parents were unhappy about my decision, but there was nothing they could do. For once, they did not have the upper hand. I wasn't going to give away what had been given to me out of love and care just because they thought Jackson deserved it all. It was a heartbreaking realization that even in this situation, my parents could not be happy for me. But it was also powerful because I understood I needed to stand up for myself, even if it meant defying my parents. As a result, my connection with my parents deteriorated significantly after I departed for college. They cut off practically all contact with me, convinced that what I had done was selfish toward my brother. Jackson and I had never been close. He was content being the preferred child, and with me out of the house, he didn't have to compete for our parents' attention. He never contacted or visited me when I was at college. While it was unsurprising, it still stung. My grandparents were the only ones that actually cared and remained in my life. They were my emotional support system, always checking in on me, encouraging me, and ensuring I didn't feel completely abandoned. But then, in my third year of college, my life was turned upside down. My grandfather died unexpectedly from a heart attack in his sleep. His death left me shattered. It was without a doubt the darkest period of my life. I spent several days with my grandmother while we mourned together. It was a devastating loss for both of us. My grandfather had been a father figure to me in every manner that mattered, and losing him created a void in my heart. During this hard time, something unexpected happened. I bonded with my parents and Jackson. My grandfather's death shook all of us, and for the first time in years, we found ourselves connecting over our shared sadness. Despite my many unresolved issues with my parents, something about the incident brought us closer. For a brief moment, it felt as if the barriers between us had fallen. My grandfather had even left a letter for my mother. In it, he begged her to stop ignoring me and to care for both of her children, not just Jackson. He reminded her of the value of family, and how she couldn't afford to continue treating one child better than the other for all these years. I guess something changed after that. Perhaps. For the first time, my parents appeared to be genuinely sorry for how they had treated me. They slowly began to make an effort to reconnect. They began calling me more regularly, inquiring about my studies, and showing an interest in my life. It wasn't perfect. The anguish of the past couldn't be erased that easily, but it was something. I was still upset with them for all the years they had disregarded me and for not being there when I needed them. But at the same time, I could see they were trying, which gave me a glimmer of optimism. I wanted to think that they could change, that perhaps, just maybe, they were beginning to recognize their mistakes. When I graduated from college, my parents actually attended the ceremony. They smiled proudly as they snapped pictures with me. It seemed odd to have them there after all those years when they hadn't even acknowledged my achievements. Following the ceremony, my parents, Jackson, my grandma, and I went out to lunch to celebrate. It was one of the few times I felt like we were a family, even if it was just for a short period. For once, I wasn't invisible to them. And that simple act of recognition meant more to me than words could describe. This year, after securing my first true high-paying job and earning my first big salary, I wanted to do something special to commemorate the occasion. I thought, why not share this moment with my family? I hadn't spent much time with my parents growing up. Simply quality time together to compensate for what we had missed over the years. Deep down, I knew I desired their attention, even after all these years of feeling overlooked. As for Jackson, I intended to get him something nice later, so he wouldn't feel excluded. I wanted the cruise trip to be a surprise for my parents, so instead of notifying them over the phone, I made a reservation at a fine, costly restaurant where we could eat and celebrate. When I called to invite my parents, they appeared excited, even thrilled, to visit the restaurant. They promised to be there on time. But when I arrived at the restaurant on time, my parents were unable to be seen. At first, I attempted to give them the benefit of doubt. Perhaps they were stuck in traffic or running a little late. However, after around 15, 20, and 30 minutes, I began to feel worried. I contacted them several times, and they did not answer. Until the sixth call, my father casually remarked that they were finishing up some last-minute errands and would be at the restaurant soon. Annoyed but hopeful, I remained at the table, waiting for them. The waiter kept coming by, asking if the rest of my group had come, and I became increasingly humiliated with each passing minute. I didn't want to look like I'd been stood up in a fine restaurant. I eventually ordered dinner for myself since I was hungry. I finished my dinner while sitting alone, glancing at the empty seats across from me. My calls to my parents remained unanswered. After that, an hour passed, followed by nearly 2 hours. Finally, after my 15th effort, my father answered the phone. He began apologizing, but I was completely irritated by this point. I started yelling at him, wondering what they had been doing all this time, and why they couldn't just tell me they weren't going to make it. "Oh, just stop complaining," he replied dismissively. "I apologize for the delay. Your mother and I were held up at the shop. We selected the ideal birthday present for your brother, but when we got to the counter, we discovered your mother had forgotten her card at home. So, we had to drive back and grab it. Fortunately, the shop had our gift, which we were able to purchase just now. Jackson is going to be overjoyed with what we picked out for him. By the way, have you purchased anything for your brother yet? You do recall that his birthday is in 2 weeks, right?" At that point, I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. I was hoping to have a memorable moment with my parents to celebrate my accomplishments and bring us closer together, but once again, Jackson was all that mattered to them. They had spent the entire evening shopping for his birthday gift, completely ignoring the fact that I had been sitting alone at the restaurant awaiting them. Not only had they missed the dinner, but they had the audacity to inquire whether I had thought to get something for Jackson. I was livid. But I tried to remain calm as I reminded my father that they could have bought for Jackson any other day. They should have respected my time, especially because I went out of my way to prepare this for them. My father's response made matters worse. He dismissed my concerns, claiming they were on their way and that we could discuss it once they arrived. However, I did not want to stay there any longer. I was furious with my parents. I paid my bill, got up from the table, and went. My phone began to vibrate as I drove back home. My parents were phoning and left voicemails stating they had arrived at the restaurant but couldn't find me. I ignored their calls because I was too angry and hurt to even consider talking to them. Later that night, my mother sent me a series of SMS. She attacked me rather than apologizing or admitting that they had made mistakes. She labeled me impolite for not being present when they finally arrived, as if I had wasted their time. She had the gall to claim that this was why they didn't care about my irrelevant intentions in the first place. I was always so impulsive, according to her. Their priorities were totally acceptable, and I was in the wrong for being furious with them. Reading her messages brought up memories of hurt and fury. I had put my heart and soul into planning something spectacular, and all I received in return was the same indifference I had felt my entire life. I simply couldn't deal with their cruel statements and frequent disregard for my sentiments. After everything I had done to make this moment memorable, I felt much more alone than before. I knew that no matter what I did, Jackson would always come first, leaving me as an afterthought. I blocked her without bothering to respond. Update number 1. The reason I bought the cruise tickets in the first place was that my parents' conduct had changed significantly following my grandfather's death. I felt they'd finally recognized me as a human being and their child, but I suppose I was mistaken again. I am delighted my eyes are awake now. Starting today, I'm done begging and crying for their attention. I will block both of them on my phone. Regarding the update, it appears that my parents have informed Jackson of the entire situation, and he phoned me this week to address it. My brother believes that our parents' actions were not improper, and that I should have respected them enough to wait for their arrival rather than fleeing at the last minute. He added that our parents were quite disappointed in me and had contacted him to protest about my activities. He invited me to his forthcoming birthday party so I could apologize to our parents. I declined his request, asking him to leave me alone for the time being. He tried to argue with me more, but I reminded him that my connection with our parents had nothing to do with him, and that he would never comprehend what I was going through. Update number 2. It's been a month since I last updated. For those who inquired, I did consider canceling my cruise reservations, but then I realized I'd spent a big portion of my paycheck on them. So I resolved to make better use of them. I chose to travel with my best friend and grandmother rather than my parents. To put it simply, the three of us had a fantastic time, and I quickly forgot about all of my parents' trouble. This trip provided a much-needed break for all of us. However, after the trip, when I shared a few photos from our cruise, I began receiving messages from my father on Facebook accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful for taking Grandma on the vacation without inviting them. I had forgotten to block my parents on Facebook because I assumed they rarely used it. My father's audacity to ask me to take him after everything he and Mom had put me through was staggering. He also mentioned how upset my mother was when I blocked her, and how he wishes I would simply go to therapy and overcome my childish behavior so I could stop torturing them for the rest of their life. Update number 3. Hello, everyone. It has been 4 months since my previous update, and I am doing well. I've blocked both my parents and Jackson. I'll admit that since cutting them off, my life has become considerably more calm. I've learned to recognize that family isn't always what you're born into. It's what you choose. Surrounding yourself with supportive friends and loved ones has made a huge difference. My grandmother and I still have a terrific relationship, and I want to take her on additional vacations in the future. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.